the thing, then it hardens. But if you add some in that's not supposed to be there and it's fully developed,
right,
you're not going to take that out. Like if you added oil, you threw some oil in the epoxy, like, now you f***ed that whole thing up. That's kind of what you're doing to a person when you raise a person famous. If you take some reality star from the time they're 5 and then they're in a sitcom.
Something doesn't add up about Justin Bieber's early rise to fame, and now the conversation is getting uncomfortable. Because recently, Joe Rogan stepped into a discussion that a lot of people had quietly ignored for years, and instead of giving clear answers, he started asking the kind of questions that make everything feel different. Questions about access, about influence, about what really happens behind the scenes when a young artist enters an industry built on power and connections. And once those questions started circulating, old clips began resurfacing. Moments involving Sean Combs talking about spending time with a very young Bieber. Clips that once felt harmless, even entertaining, now being watched again with a completely different perspective. Because when you hear phrases about private time, experiences that can't be talked about, and environments that sound exclusive, it changes how people interpret everything. And then there's Ellen DeGeneres. For years, she was seen as one of the safest figures in entertainment, daytime TV, laughter, positive energy. But now, people are going back, looking at her connections, her interactions, her presence in the same circles, and asking questions they never asked before. Not accusations. Questions. And sometimes, questions hit harder than answers. Because when you start placing all these pieces together, a young artist, powerful figures, private environments, resurfaced clips, it creates a narrative that feels bigger than any one moment. And here's the part that really makes people stop and think. This isn't just about what happened back then. It's about how it looks now. Because the same clips that once passed without a second thought are now being replayed under a completely different lens. And the more people look, the more they start wondering. Was everything really as normal as it seemed? Or are we only now starting to see something that's been there all along? Because if even part of this connects the way people think it might, then the story we thought we knew about Justin Bieber's rise might not be the full story at all. Before the questions started, before the clips were replayed, before names like Joe Rogan, Sean Combs, and Ellen DeGeneres were even part of the same conversation, Justin Bieber's story looked like one of the cleanest success stories the industry had ever seen. A kid from Canada, discovered on YouTube, turned into a global superstar almost overnight. That's the version everyone knew. And for years, nobody really questioned it. Because on the surface, everything made sense. Bieber was talented, charismatic, and perfectly positioned for the moment. Social media was exploding, the industry was shifting, and he became one of the first artists to fully ride that wave into worldwide fame. But behind that rapid rise, there was something else happening. Something people didn't really focus on at the time. Because Bieber didn't just enter the industry. He was pulled into it. Fast. At a very young age. And when that happens, when a 13-year-old suddenly moves from a normal life into a world full of power, money, and influence, the environment around them matters just as much as their talent. That's where the background starts getting more complicated. Because early in his career, Bieber wasn't navigating this world alone. He was surrounded by major industry figures, people who weren't just artists, but gatekeepers. People who could open doors, shape careers, and control access to opportunities. One of those early connections was mentorship, guidance that introduced him to bigger spaces, bigger rooms, and bigger names. And eventually, those connections led him toward circles that included figures like Sean Combs. At the time, none of this felt unusual. In the entertainment world, mentorship is normal. Young artists being guided by established figures is part of the system. It's how careers are built. It's how doors get opened. But here's the part that only started standing out later. Not all mentorship looks the same. Because years after those early interactions, certain clips began resurfacing. Moments where Diddy talked about spending time with Bieber in ways that felt casual back then, but now raise questions. References to private time. To experiences that couldn't be fully shared publicly. At the time, people laughed it off. Now, they are looking at it differently. And that shift in perspective is what changed everything. Because when you combine that with how young Bieber was at the time, it starts to create a different kind of conversation. Not about success, but about environment and influence. At the same time, Bieber's own journey began showing signs that things weren't as simple as they looked. As he got older, his public image started shifting. There were moments of rebellion, emotional interviews, visible struggles, things that people initially blamed on fame, pressure, and growing up in the spotlight. And to be fair, that explanation made sense. Fame at that level is overwhelming for anyone, especially someone that young. But over time, even Bieber himself started hinting at something deeper. He spoke about trust issues. About people around him not always being who they seemed. About experiences that shaped how he saw the industry. He didn't lay everything out clearly. But he didn't need to. Because the tone alone told people that there was more to the story. And that's where the conversation started evolving. Because now, people weren't just looking at Bieber's rise as a success story, they were looking at it as a journey through an environment they didn't fully understand. An environment where access matters. Where connections matter. Where being in the right rooms can change everything. And once that idea takes hold, it naturally leads to more questions. Like who controls those rooms? Who decides who gets access? And what actually happens inside them? That's where names like Ellen DeGeneres started getting pulled into the broader conversation, not because of direct claims, but because of proximity. Because when people look back, they don't just look at isolated moments. They look at networks, at relationships, at repeated interactions. Ellen, for years, was one of the most visible and trusted figures in entertainment. Her platform introduced countless artists to the public. Her show became a space where celebrities felt safe, where everything appeared light, positive, and controlled. And Bieber? He was part of that world. Frequent appearances. Friendly interactions. A familiar presence. At the time, it reinforced his image. But now, with the conversation shifting, people are looking at those same interactions through a different lens. Not as proof of anything specific, but as part of a larger picture they are trying to understand. And that's the key difference. This isn't about confirmed answers. It's about changing perspectives. Because once people start questioning how an environment works, every piece connected to that environment becomes part of the discussion. Even if it wasn't before. Meanwhile, Joe Rogan's role in all of this isn't about presenting evidence, it's about asking questions that push people to reconsider what they thought they knew. He doesn't come in with headlines. He comes in with patterns. With observations. With the idea that when similar situations appear across different people and different moments, it might not be random. And that's what made his comments hit differently. Because he wasn't just talking about Bieber. He was talking about a system. A system where young talent enters powerful spaces. Where influence is concentrated. Where not everything is visible from the outside. And when you start looking at Bieber's story through that lens, it changes the tone completely. Because now, it's not just about how he became famous. It's about what he experienced along the way. And whether the version of events the public accepted for years was ever the full story to begin with. That's the background that sets everything up. A rise that looked perfect. An environment that wasn't fully understood. And a conversation that, years later, is finally starting to ask the questions nobody asked before. Because once those questions are out there, they don't go away. The real conflict didn't start when Joe Rogan spoke about it. It started when people went back and saw things differently. Because for years, moments involving Justin Bieber and powerful industry figures were treated as normal. Funny clips. Light interviews. Behind-the-scenes glimpses that felt harmless at the time. Nobody questioned them. Nobody paused long enough to ask what was really going on. But now? Those same moments don't feel the same anymore. And that shift, that change in perception, is where everything begins to unravel. It started with resurfaced clips involving Sean Combs. Old footage where he talked about spending time with a very young Bieber. At the time, it was framed as mentorship, guidance, opportunity. The kind of thing that happens in entertainment all the time. But listening to it now, people are hearing something different. References to private time. Statements about experiences that can't be talked about. A tone that, in today's context, feels less casual and more uncomfortable. And that's where the first crack appears. Because once people start questioning one moment, they start questioning everything. Why was someone that young placed in those kinds of environments? Why was there so much emphasis on exclusivity, on access that others didn't have? And why did it all seem normal back then, but doesn't now? Those questions spread fast. Because they don't just apply to one clip, they apply to a pattern. And that's exactly what Rogan focused on. Not proving a single claim, but highlighting repetition. The idea that when similar situations show up across different moments, different people, and different time periods, it might point to something bigger than coincidence. And once that idea takes hold, the story changes completely. Because now, this isn't just about Bieber anymore. It's about the environment he entered. And who controlled it. At the same time, Bieber's own behavior started getting re-examined. His emotional interviews. His struggles with fame. His comments about trust and betrayal. For years, those were explained as the side effects of being famous too young. But now, people are asking a different question. What if those reactions weren't just about fame? What if they were about experiences? Experiences he never fully explained, but hinted at. That's where the tension builds. Because there's no clear confirmation, just pieces. Pieces that don't fully connect, but don't fully separate either. And in a situation like that, uncertainty becomes the driving force. Meanwhile, another name started getting pulled into the conversation, Ellen DeGeneres. Not because of direct accusations, but because of proximity. Because when people start mapping out connections, they don't just look at what happened, they look at who was around when it happened. Ellen's platform was one of the biggest in entertainment. A place where celebrities appeared regularly. A space that felt safe, controlled, and widely trusted. And Bieber? He was a frequent presence. At the time, it reinforced his mainstream image. But now, those same appearances are being re-examined, not as proof of anything specific, but as part of a larger network people are trying to understand. Who had access? Who interacted with who? Who moved within the same circles? Because once those questions start, they don't stay limited. They expand. And that expansion is what creates the conflict. Because now, you have two completely different interpretations of the same story. On one side, a young artist discovered, mentored, and guided through the industry by powerful figures who helped him succeed. On the other, a young artist entering environments he didn't fully understand, surrounded by people with influence he couldn't control, navigating situations that may not have been as simple as they appeared. Both interpretations use the same moments, the same clips, the same timeline, but they lead to completely different conclusions. And that's what makes this so intense. Because there's no single moment that proves one side or the other. There's only perspective. And perspective is shifting in real time. Then comes the first real twist, the moment where everything flips. Because the focus stops being on what happened back then, and shifts to how it's being interpreted now. Think about that. Nothing in those old clips has changed. The words are the same. The actions are the same. But the meaning? That's what's different. And that difference changes everything. Because it reveals something bigger than the story itself. It reveals how context shapes perception. How what feels normal in one moment can feel completely different years later. And how the public can revisit a narrative and completely rewrite it, without any new information. That's the twist. Because it means this isn't just about hidden truths being uncovered. It's about visible moments being reinterpreted. And that creates a completely new kind of tension. Because if meaning can change like that, then what else has been misunderstood? What else has been overlooked? What else might feel different if people look at it again? And that's where the situation becomes unstable. Because now, the conversation isn't based on clear facts. It's based on evolving perception. On questions without definitive answers. On patterns that suggest something, but don't fully confirm it. And in that space, everything becomes uncertain. Meanwhile, the silence from the people involved only adds to that uncertainty. No direct explanations. No detailed responses. Just fragments, old clips, past interviews, resurfaced moments. And the more those fragments circulate, the more they fuel the same cycle. Question. Speculation. Reinterpretation. Because without clarity, people fill in the gaps themselves. And those interpretations don't always align. Which brings us back to the core conflict. Not between individuals, but between narratives. The official story versus the perceived one. The version people accepted for years versus the version they're starting to question now. And neither side has fully taken over. They exist side by side. Competing. Expanding. Pulling more people into the conversation every day. And that's what makes this moment so critical. Because once a story reaches this point, it doesn't go back to what it was before. Even if nothing new is confirmed. Even if no one steps forward with answers. The perception has already changed. And perception? That's what shapes everything moving forward. So now, the real question isn't just what happened to Justin Bieber. It's this. Why are people only now starting to see it differently? And if this is the first twist, what happens when the next one hits? The moment the conversation shifted from old clips to possible patterns, everything escalated, and fast. Because once people stopped looking at Justin Bieber as just an individual story and started viewing his early years as part of a broader environment, the tone changed completely. It wasn't about one interaction anymore, it was about how the entire system might operate. And that's where things got uncomfortable. At first, the internet focused on what was already visible, resurfaced footage, interviews, casual moments that didn't feel so casual anymore. But then, a second wave hit. People began linking those moments together, asking not just what happened, but how often similar situations might have occurred. That's when the escalation became undeniable. Because now, multiple names started getting pulled into the same conversation, not as confirmed connections, but as part of a wider discussion about proximity, influence, and access. Names like Sean Combs came back into focus, especially with those earlier clips where he described spending time with Bieber in ways that raised eyebrows today. Back then, it sounded like opportunity. Now, it sounds like something people want explained. And that difference is everything. Because when a moment shifts from normal to questionable, it forces people to reevaluate everything around it. Why was that interaction framed the way it was? Why were certain details left vague? And why did nobody question it at the time? Those questions didn't just stay limited to one person. They expanded outward. And that's where Ellen DeGeneres entered the conversation in a much bigger way, not through direct claims, but through association. Through the idea that powerful figures often exist within the same circles, attend the same events, and operate within the same spaces. That's when the narrative started leaning towards something deeper. Not a single incident, but a network. A structure. An environment where access isn't random, it's controlled. And once that idea takes hold, everything changes. Because now, people aren't just asking what happened. They're asking who was around when it happened. Who had influence? Who facilitated introductions? Who made certain opportunities possible? And those questions are much harder to answer. At the same time, Bieber's own journey began looking different under this new lens. His past struggles, once attributed purely to fame, started being reconsidered. Emotional interviews where he spoke about trust issues, moments where he hinted at feeling used or misunderstood. His protective stance toward younger artists later in his career. Individually, those moments didn't prove anything. But together, they started forming a narrative that felt heavier. A narrative that suggested his experience in the industry might have been more complicated than people originally believed. And that's where the shocking reveal element begins, not as a confirmed fact, but as a shift in understanding. Because the biggest realization people are coming to isn't about a single event. It's about possibility. The possibility that what looked like mentorship may have included elements people didn't fully understand. The possibility that environments designed for success may also carry risks, especially for someone entering them at such a young age. The possibility that silence, over time, can mean different things depending on how you look at it. And that's what makes this stage so intense. Because nothing is being definitively proven. But everything is being reconsidered. Meanwhile, Joe Rogan's role in all of this becomes clearer, not as someone providing answers, but as someone amplifying the questions. By framing the situation as a pattern rather than an isolated case, he shifted the focus from what happened to Bieber to how does this industry actually work? And that's a much bigger conversation. Because once you start asking that question, you can't limit it to one person. You have to look at repetition, at similarities, at how different stories might overlap, not in exact detail, but in structure. Young talent enters the industry early. They are introduced to powerful figures. They gain access to exclusive spaces. And then, years later, they show signs of having gone through something deeper than just fame. That pattern, whether coincidental or not, is what people are reacting to. And it's what makes the situation feel bigger than any single name involved. At the same time, the reaction from the public continues to intensify. Some people are convinced there's something more beneath the surface, that too many details feel off, too many moments don't align, too many questions remain unanswered. Others push back, pointing out that speculation can easily spiral into assumptions without evidence. They argue that revisiting old clips with a new mindset doesn't automatically change what actually happened. And that divide? It keeps the conversation alive. Because both sides are engaging with the same material, but interpreting it completely differently. And that's what keeps the escalation going. Every new perspective adds another layer. Every resurfaced clip adds another angle. Every silence adds another question. Until the situation becomes something much larger than where it started. And that brings us to the real reveal, the part that hits hardest. It's not a confirmed secret. It's not a hidden piece of evidence. It's a realization that the story people thought they understood might not be complete. That the version of events accepted for years might only be one side of a much more complex picture. And that once you start questioning that picture, it's very hard to see it the same way again. Because now, every detail carries weight. Every interaction feels significant. Every unanswered question feels intentional. And whether or not any of it leads to a clear conclusion, the perception has already changed. And in a situation like this, perception is powerful. Because once the public starts looking at something differently, that shift doesn't reverse easily. So now, the conversation isn't slowing down. It's building, expanding, pulling in more voices, more opinions, more interpretations. And the most shocking part? It's all happening without a single definitive answer. Just questions, patterns, and a growing sense that there's more to the story than what was originally seen. And if that's where things are now, then the next phase might take it even further. Once the conversation reached this level, the reactions didn't just stay online, they spread across the entire entertainment space. What started as people revisiting old clips quickly turned into a full-scale debate about how the industry treats young talent, and suddenly, everyone had an opinion. At first, the public response was mixed. Some people immediately pushed back against the growing speculation. They argued that revisiting old moments with a new mindset doesn't automatically change what actually happened. To them, Justin Bieber was simply another example of a young artist dealing with the pressures of fame, nothing more, nothing less. They warned that reading too deeply into past interactions could lead to unfair assumptions. But that perspective didn't dominate for long. Because as more people engaged with the conversation, a different tone started taking over, one that focused less on defending the past and more on questioning it. Viewers began pointing out how many moments felt different now, how certain clips carried a weight they didn't notice before, and how the idea of normal industry behavior might not be as straightforward as it once seemed. And once that shift happened, the discussion exploded. Social media platforms filled with breakdowns, side-by-side comparisons, and long threads analyzing everything from tone of voice to body language. People weren't just reacting, they were investigating. They revisited interviews, performances, and appearances, looking for patterns that could support or challenge the growing narrative. Meanwhile, the reaction toward Sean Combs became one of the most intense parts of the conversation. Old clips involving him started circulating at a much higher rate, and people began questioning interactions that had previously gone unquestioned. Again, this wasn't about confirmed conclusions, it was about how those moments were being interpreted now. The same footage that once felt lighthearted was being re-examined through a more critical lens, and that alone changed how people talked about it. At the same time, Ellen DeGeneres found herself pulled into the broader discussion, not because of direct claims, but because of association. Her long-standing presence in the industry, her connections, and her interactions with various celebrities made her part of the conversation people were trying to map out. And that's where the industry reaction became more noticeable. Because while many celebrities didn't directly address the situation, the indirect signals were clear. Conversations on podcasts, subtle remarks in interviews, and general discussions about how the industry works began popping up more frequently. It wasn't always tied to specific names, but the timing made it obvious that something had shifted. Media outlets also played a role in amplifying the discussion. Some framed it as a broader look at the pressures young artists face. Others focused on the idea of changing perspectives, highlighting how public opinion can evolve over time. Instead of making direct claims, many reports leaned into the uncertainty, presenting the situation as an open question rather than a closed case. And that approach only fueled more engagement. Because when something is left unresolved, people fill in the gaps themselves. That's exactly what happened here. Different groups formed around different interpretations. Some believed there was a deeper issue worth exploring, pointing to repeated patterns and unresolved questions. Others remained skeptical, emphasizing the lack of concrete evidence and warning against turning speculation into fact. That divide kept the conversation alive. Because every new argument created more discussion, more analysis, more attention. And then there was the reaction specifically toward Joe Rogan. His involvement didn't just bring attention, it gave the conversation a different kind of weight. Known for discussing controversial topics, his approach of focusing on patterns rather than direct claims resonated with a large audience. For some, it validated the idea that there was more to the story. For others, it raised concerns about how easily speculation can spread when framed as open-ended questioning. Either way, his role ensured that the conversation didn't fade quickly. It expanded. And that expansion brought in more voices from outside the immediate fanbase, people who might not have followed Bieber's early career closely, but were now engaging with the broader topic of industry dynamics. At the same time, there was also a quieter, more reflective reaction. Some observers shifted the focus away from specific individuals and toward the system itself. They questioned how young artists are introduced to powerful environments, how mentorship works in practice, and what safeguards exist, or don't exist, for people entering the industry at such a young age. This perspective didn't rely on proving any single narrative. Instead, it asked a more general question. How much do we really understand about what happens behind the scenes? And that question resonated widely. Because it didn't require agreement on the details, it only required curiosity. As the conversation continued, one thing became clear. The reactions weren't just responding to the story. They were shaping it. Every post, every analysis, every debate added another layer to how the situation was being understood. What started as a few resurfaced clips turned into a much larger discussion about perception, influence, and the complexities of fame. And by this stage, the narrative had moved far beyond its original point. It wasn't just about Justin Bieber anymore. It was about how stories evolve over time. How public opinion can shift without new evidence. And how the same set of moments can lead to completely different conclusions depending on how they are viewed. That's what made this phase so important. Because once a conversation reaches this level of attention and interpretation, it doesn't just reflect reality. It begins to redefine it. And just when it felt like the conversation had reached its peak, when every clip had been replayed, every angle debated, every perspective pushed to the limit, that's when the final twist started to take shape. Because the biggest shift wasn't in what people discovered. It was in how they started thinking. Up until now, the focus had been on Justin Bieber, his past, his early career, the people around him, and the environments he stepped into. The questions were all centered on him. But suddenly, that focus began to expand. And that's where everything changed. Because people started asking something much bigger. What if this was never just about Bieber? What if his story is just one example of something that's been happening for a long time, in ways the public doesn't fully see? That idea flipped the entire narrative. Because now, it wasn't just about revisiting old clips or analyzing past interactions, it was about understanding a system. A structure where young talent enters an industry filled with power, influence, and access that isn't always visible from the outside. And once you start thinking like that, you can't unsee it. Every connection starts to matter more. Every interaction feels more significant. Every unanswered question feels like it could lead somewhere deeper. And that's where the tension really builds. Because while the public conversation keeps expanding, the people at the center of it, Sean Combs, Ellen DeGeneres, and even voices like Joe Rogan, aren't providing clear, direct answers that settle everything. Instead, there's silence. Or partial responses. Or discussions that raise more questions than they answer. And in a situation like this, silence doesn't calm things down. It makes everything louder. Because without definitive explanations, people start filling in the gaps themselves. They build theories. They connect dots. They interpret patterns. And the more they do that, the more the narrative evolves, sometimes beyond what can actually be proven. That's the moment where the story becomes unstable. Not because new facts are being revealed, but because perception is shifting faster than certainty. And that's what makes this final twist so powerful. Because it forces one uncomfortable realization. We might never get a clear answer. Think about that. All these discussions. All these clips. All these connections. And still, no definitive conclusion. No single moment that confirms everything. No statement that closes the case. Just layers of interpretation built on top of moments that people are seeing differently now. And that uncertainty? It becomes the driving force of the entire story. Because now, every new detail, no matter how small, feels important. Every new comment, every resurfaced video, every shift in behavior becomes something people analyze for meaning. Meanwhile, Bieber's own presence in all of this remains complex. He hasn't stepped forward to directly address these specific narratives in a way that resolves them. Instead, his past interviews, his emotional reflections, and his evolving perspective on the industry continue to be the main reference points people use. And those moments? They don't give clear answers. They give feelings. They suggest depth. They hint at experiences that aren't fully explained. And that ambiguity keeps everything open. At the same time, the broader industry conversation continues to grow. More people are asking questions, not just about Bieber, but about how young artists are introduced to powerful environments in general. What kind of protections exist? What kind of oversight is in place? And how much of what happens behind the scenes actually reaches the public? Those questions don't rely on any single narrative. They exist independently. And that's what makes them so impactful. Because even if the original story fades, the questions remain. And then comes the cliffhanger. Because right now, we're in a moment where everything is paused, but not resolved. The conversation is still active. The interpretations are still evolving. And the attention hasn't gone anywhere. So what happens next? Do more people speak up? Do new details emerge that clarify what's being discussed? Or does the story slowly fade, leaving behind nothing but speculation and a completely changed perception? Because here's the reality. Once a narrative reaches this point, it doesn't simply disappear. It either evolves, or it transforms into something even bigger. And if more voices enter the conversation, if more stories start aligning with the same patterns people think they are seeing, then this might not just be about revisiting the past anymore. It could become about redefining how people understand the entire industry. So the real question isn't just what happened before. It's this. What happens when more people start asking the same questions and refuse to stop? Now it's your turn, because this conversation clearly isn't as simple as it first looked. After everything we just broke down, I want to know where you stand. Do you think the story around Justin Bieber is just being reinterpreted years later, or does it feel like people are finally asking the right questions about what really happens behind the scenes? And what about Sean Combs and Ellen DeGeneres being part of the same conversation? Do you see that as coincidence, or does it make you look at those old moments differently? Then there's Joe Rogan. Do you think he's just raising open-ended questions like he always does, or is he pointing towards something people weren't ready to notice before? Drop your honest opinion in the comments right now. I'm genuinely curious how you're reading this situation, because everyone seems to see it differently. Also, if you made it this far, hit that like button so more people can join the discussion. The more perspectives we get, the clearer, or maybe even more complicated, this whole situation becomes. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Stories like this don't just end, they evolve. And if anything new comes out, you already know we're going to break it down step by step. Stay locked in, because if this conversation keeps growing the way it is right now, the next update could completely change how people see this entire story.